Alexander Graham Bell. You probably recognize the name from grade school, where you learned that he changed the world with the invention of the telephone. Located in the heart of Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, the Alexander Graham Bell Museum can be found. Owned and operated by Parks Canada, this museum is a testimony to his life and his work. Canada is home to some of the world's best national parks and historic sites. We decided to spend some time in September of 2020 exploring some of these amazing places. In this video, we are going to be looking through the eyes of Bell himself as we tour the facility with the help of the knowledgeable staff at Parks Canada. As we learn, he was much more than just the inventor of the telephone.
So, I want to welcome you to the Alexander Graham Bell Natural Historic Site. This museum is here. It was established in 1956, and it is located across the bay from the original estate of Mr. Bell, Dr. Bell as he's known. And the reason this is here is because the girls gave all the artifacts to Parks Canada, and they wanted the museum established across the bay from the estate, and they gave all the artifacts as a donation to the people of Canada. So when we opened this museum, this front hall was actually here. That day was a great day for the community because people that actually worked on the estate got to come here to the opening of the museum. And the girls were here. They actually officially opened it. And since then, we've added a hall in 1978 to expand the museum because of more artifacts that we received and just to properly display everything. And then in 1980s, an addition was made for a children's area. So that was also a good addition for us because Bell loved having children around to have them explore and learn and do by experimenting with him. One of his big things was to have children around and not have them stay out of sight and out of mind, which was common back then. He wanted children to be active, take part in it, ask questions, and learn by actually doing. So he did tell his workers, do not tell a child to be quiet, answer their questions, and if you don't know the answer, ask yourself why. So when you come in here, the first hall you'll see the reception area and the front hall. We have a fun kite corner. We do invite you to go and fly a kite, which is the nicest way to hear it. Under other circumstances, not so much. In this front hall, you will see on the mezzanine, we have our cafe, our museum store. We have a collection of photographs from the National Geographic of Mr. Bell and his work, some family photographs, some experiments and whatnot. The reason that is there is because Dr. Bell was actually the second president and one of the founding members of the National Geographic Society. His father-in-law was the first one, he was the second one, and later on he hired his son-in-law, Mabel Grovner, to be the editor-at-large. And if you know the Grosvenor name from the Geographic, that's where it came from. So it's all connected. As you look out these big windows, you'll see the beautiful Bredor Lakes, Kingston Island to your right, the estate is to your left. You will see from the point of land to the top of the mountain, that's the extent of the estate. It is around 450 acres. At the point of land, you'll see the home, Bendrea, which is Gaelic for beautiful mountain. And the top of the property, on top of the mountain, is where the graves are located. Both Dr. and Mrs. Bell are buried there, as well as members of the family. It is a private estate. You can only go there if you're invited. If you get to wear the SNES uniform, you can sneak over to once in a while. And we do respect the family's privacy. It is a private estate. So we don't know anything about their personal financial business. We have no idea if the phone company still provides money for them. We do protect their privacy. If they come in here and we recognize them as family members, we will not point them out to you. They are free to come in here as regular individuals, and that's what helps make the relationship with us very special. They learn from us, we learn from them, and we get a great kick out of the younger generations coming in and asking us questions, and we fill them in on their family history, things they don't know and they're still discovering. So that's pretty cool. As you proceed down this way, the sound and the silence. This is a hall of his early works, his early life. The one thing that directed his life, all his life, was sound. His mother was hard of hearing, and his father was a teacher of the deaf and a teacher of speech and elocution mostly. So was his grandfather, Alexander Bell. He was actually born on his grandfather's birthday, so there was Alexander Bell, the grandfather, Alexander Melville Bell, the son, who was a teacher of speech and elocution, and then young Alexander Bell, the middle of three sons. When he was 11 years old, he picked out his old middle name of Graham. That way you could tell him apart from his father and grandfather. And since all three boys were homeschooled, this kind of free thinking and free will was highly encouraged, which back in Victorian times was quite uncommon. So because of their free-spirited ways and the way they were brought up, they were very curious and very diverse education. The mother taught them piano and art classes. He actually became a very, very good pianist. He could have become a concert pianist if he wanted to. So how he would communicate with his mother would be to either fingerspell for her what was being said, or speak close to her temple. She could feel the vibrations and understand what he was saying. So I strongly suspect that he was her favorite son, I'm thinking. As you come down through here, you will see his two brothers. He had a brother, Edward, known as Teddy, and Melville, known as Melly. Unfortunately for the family, both brothers died of tuberculosis as young men, and Bell himself became quite ill. So the decision was made by Melville to move the family to Canada. He'd been here before, and he had friends here, so they wound up settling in Ontario, a place called Tutela Heights, near Brantford. They bought a home there, and Alexander Graham Bell spent the next few months recuperating his health, just sitting behind the house by the river, just enjoying the fresh air. And his mind was always thinking. It's here that he actually thought of the telephone invention. The transmission of sound. How does the sound get from your mouth to someone else's ear, and could you actually reproduce that process? So that's what he started thinking on and working on and writing his notes. About a year or so later, he actually went to Boston to start his lifelong career as a teacher of the deaf. That was his lifelong passion and profession. So he's teaching the students in the daytime. He's working on his telephone invention at night, and he is taking on private students from wealthy families. In those days, if you were a deaf child or handicapped in any way, you actually were shoved off in the corner. Nobody talked about you, or you weren't discussed in public, because it was kind of a shameful thing to have a handicapped child. With him, it was very different. He was an oralist. He believed that you could teach a child to speak normally without sign language, and he used his father's system of visible speech, where he developed this over several years, figuring out how the vocal organs work. I've studied this a bit, and I still can't get my head around it. His father was equally brilliant, I'm sure. So he's using this method. He's starting to teach students how to speak normally. Wealthy parents start sending their kids to be taught by him, and this is how he meets his future bride, Mabel Hubbard. Her father, Gardiner Hubbard, was a patent lawyer and businessman, and he was investing in things like telegraphy, railroads, any new technology coming along at the time. So he decided that he would allow Bell to teach his daughter in exchange for him financing his telephone invention and experiments. So after a time, Mabel, when she first met him, she wasn't too impressed with him. This is a young lady who lost her hearing when she was 5 from scarlet fever, and her parents very wisely chose to keep her talking and keep her educated. And she learned to read lips very clearly, very carefully. She was sent off to Europe when she was 13 years old to go to a school in Vienna. She comes back to the States a year or a little bit later, and she can speak, read, and read lips in German, French, Italian, and English, of course. So when she meets him, she's not impressed with him. She was only 15 years old. He was 25. She was an old man of 40. But over time, she came to like him and respect him because of his kind and gentle manner. So eventually, he has to get someone else to teach her because, according to social mores at the time, he was falling in love with her, so he couldn't teach her anymore. He approaches her parents with his intentions, and he was told, no, wait a year and see how she feels a year from now. He was allowed to start courting her, and eventually he did win her over, and on her 18th birthday, Thanksgiving, they became engaged. But the conflict and the struggle to get to the engagement was a tough one for him. He really, really wanted to be with her, but his future father-in-law was after him to finish his telephone invention and stop teaching, which of course for him was not even a consideration. So it's only a week after his 29th birthday, on March 10th of 1876, that the first words spoken over a very crude wire, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you," were spoken. Mr. Watson was Thomas Watson, a young electrician he hired to work with him to have the technical knowledge to actually create this invention. So with that, not too long after that, he got the patent for the phone, and within a year or two of the patent being filed and the phone company being formed, he started making some serious money. But as any young romantic person does, the first serious money he made was $85, which he spent every cent of it on a silver model telephone, which you see here on display. And he gave that to his future bride as an engagement present and a wedding present. So he also gave her an 11 pearl cross necklace, which was a very personal gift. She was a religious person, him not so much. And the most important gift he gave her for the wedding present was all but 10 of his shares of the telephone company stock, which made her very wealthy. So if you're wondering why the phone company is called Mabel, it's likely because of her, and also the family atmosphere when the employees work for the company. They honeymooned in Europe for over a year. Their first daughter was born there, Elsie. Then they moved back to Washington, D.C., where their home was established. That was their main home. And at the time, he starts making serious money, so they have a very wealthy and rich lifestyle. They're hobnobbing with the rich and famous, and they're very prominent. And with her social connections, they have to maintain the society lifestyle, which he wasn't really crazy about that. He preferred to be tooling away at his inventions and working on different things. So also the heat and humidity really bothered him. Because of his previous illness, headaches were a big problem for him. And where he kept really strange hours, he'd be up all night long working and sleep late in the morning. His routine was disrupted quite often with the schedule. So he's looking for a place to get away from the pressure of Washington society and just some more time and freedom to be who he wants to be, dress the way he wants to dress, and work on the things he wants to work on. So he read a book by Charles Dudley Warner called Baddeck and that sort of thing. And it talked about Baddeck and other places in the area. So he decides to come here on vacation with his family on the way to Newfoundland. He did make his way here. He stayed here in Baddeck, the Telegraph Hotel. You'll see that one on the main street. It's a big black hotel on the right-hand side going back up. And he stayed there for 3 weeks. And as he's staying there, they look across the bay over there to what was known as the Red Head Peninsula. And at the time, they engaged a man to buy property for them. They were renting a house on Crescent Grove. That's on the Bay Road here, crossing the bay. And it took several years, but he starts buying property on the peninsula until he eventually gets all the property he wants. And he renames the whole estate Benvrail, Gaelic for Beautiful Mountain. The first home they built there, while they were still getting property, was called The Lodge, a 13-room chalet. It was built with green wood, which was something that they didn't realize was not advisable. So when they spent their first year there, after a year they could actually stick their head in between the lumber because of the gaps that were caused. So that was just their first experience with Cape Breton lifestyle and way of doing things. When they did get all the property they wanted, they went on to build their bigger house because the smaller one, 13 rooms, just wasn't cutting it anymore for them. They actually had to close in the verandas because they kept inviting friends and family to come over. And when you came over here for a visit, you stayed for several weeks because you had to pack everything you owned and basically come here ready to stay for a long stretch because travel was quite involved and you stayed for a long time. And then if you forgot something, well, you forgot it. You do without it. So they wound up building their big, beautiful home, Benvrail Hall. At the time, the people in New York and Washington and Boston thought he's crazy. He'll never build that big house here. It's a 37-room, 10-bedroom, 11-fireplace manor. It was built in 1892, 1893. It has a 10-foot rock and cement basement. The construction was done with local artisans and craftspeople. It was a Boston firm that actually designed it. And because they were in discussions to what to do when and where to put this and whatnot, Belle got fed up with Mabel not deciding what she wanted to do. They actually had a pulley system rigged to lift them up to see where all the windows would be, to get a view of the lakes and the property from every angle you could think of. And then when the house was built, she actually spent the next number of years redesigning the interior to suit herself. One thing they wound up doing was where the front entrance was facing the bay, the lake, she actually changed it to come into the back entrance. They built a porte cochere and then you walked in from that way. So over time, Mabel actually was in charge of the estate. She ran the whole thing. She was the head and tail to the whole property. She managed all the staff. She managed her husband. She managed the finances. She got involved in the community. She was doing all sorts of things to keep things running very smoothly. And she was a very smart, intelligent woman. Meanwhile, that freed up her husband to actually do the inventing and creating he wanted to do. So when they first came here to Baddeck, she went to the local mercantile store and ordered boys' clothing. People thought they had two sons. When they found out that she actually had her two girls dressed in boys' clothes, and they ran around the fields and jumped in mud puddles and went through brooks and ran around bare feet and totally undignified for them. The locals were quite shocked, and they said, young ladies shouldn't behave that way, it's not appropriate. She politely told them they are children. Why punish them for being girls? So that gave you a good indication of her thought process and her upbringing and how progressive she was. When she actually married him, he struck it big because he was perfectly matched for somebody that could understand him and manage him and basically redirect his attention to things, because he was a very much head in the clouds kind of guy. She knew when to bring him back down to earth and redirect him and give him really good advice. When you go through this section here, which is the ideas and inventions, most people know that he's the inventor of the telephone, but they have no idea of all the other stuff he was doing. And this man was involved in a lot of things. He studied aerodynamics, he studied eugenics, he had sheep breeding going on, he was doing all kinds of scientific experiments. But basically throughout his career it was always sound. People don't realize that he invented the audiometer, used to measure your hearing, and the term decibel is named after him. He invented the flat wax record. He bought the phonograph from Thomas Edison and turned it into the graphophone and returned that to Edison. He bought it for like just a short amount of money, a small amount of money, and he resold it for $20,000 and used that for more experiments. He of course had the telephone company involvement, but he didn't really get involved in that too much. He let his wife take care of the business. He was involved in sonar, flight, anything to do with science and discovering things. One of his greater inventions as far as he was concerned was the photophone. That is a sound transmission through sunlight. It worked great as long as it was sunny, but a cloudy day or at nighttime it was no good. But he was so impressed with that one, he thought it was better than the telephone. And he actually wanted to name his second daughter Photophone when she was born, around the same time the phone was. And his wife said, no, we're calling her Marion, and she was known as Daisy. Luckily for her, she wasn't stuck with the name Photophone Bell. So as he goes on through his life, his wife is right there by his side, as I mentioned. He always wants to learn and discover, and his lifelong dream since he was a child was flight, getting a man to fly. So he's working with aerodynamics, he's studying birds flying. Anything he was creating, his kites that he started originally, he starts making them in the shape of birds' wings. And then he discovers the tetrahedral shape, which is 3 equilateral triangles, makes a 4-sided shape. And with that, it's heavyweight, it's lightweight, it's highly functional. He connects them all together, and he creates kites with them. You'll see them over here. Originally, he had the white fabric. It was easy to get white cotton to get kites made. And because he wanted to photograph and document everything he was doing, white didn't show up very well in the skyline. So he went in the house one day to find something better to use, and Mrs. Bell just happened to have received in the mail a bolt of beautiful red silk to make a dress for herself. Well, unfortunately for her, the next day the ladies on the estate were sewing those lovely fabric squares for the tetrahedral cell. I'm assuming he got into the doghouse for that one for quite a while. She was not impressed with him at all for that one. The reason he was documenting all these things, when he did invent the telephone, he had several patent challenges. Over a 20-year time span, he had over 500 patent challenges to his telephone. But because he documented everything so carefully, from the time he actually thought of the invention, when he was in Boston working on it, he was coming back to Brantford with his parents to work on it some more, any correspondence, any letters, anything he was drawing, he kept very careful notes and documents and everything, so he could follow his progress and show people, here's what I did, when I did it, the dates, the times, who was there, everything. That's why he successfully defended his patent over 500 times. But he found that emotionally draining and just such a bother, and it was all the time going to quote with that telephone invention of his. He came to regret and wished he hadn't invented it. Good thing he did. When you go through this museum and you see all the inventions, you'll notice that he went from kites to flight with planes. At the time, a lot of people were flying. The Chinese were flying, the New Zealanders. The Wright brothers had the first airplane in North America as far as flight was concerned. But this is called the Silver Dart. He had he had the red wing, the white wing, the June bug, those were the 3 first planes, and the fourth one, the Silver Dart, which successfully flew here in 1909, on February 23rd. The distinction we make with this plane is that it had ailerons, which was new technology, and a tricycle undercarriage. You could actually control the flight. The Wright brothers had wing warping, and they were catapulting or launching from places to actually fly. This plane actually was on the ice. You turned on the motor, it started, you could take off when you wanted, fly as you wanted, and land when you wanted. Mind you, it didn't have brakes, no heated seats, as you can see. It was a flat piece of board. When they flew in February, they actually had fur coat on because it was really cold. This was quite a fantastic sight to see back in that day. So that day when the plane actually flew, the school children were at school, the whole community came down to watch this. Boys were skating behind the plane, never thinking it was going to actually fly. And when it did, it was quite fantastic. After the flight was successful, people were invited back to the estate, to the house, to have some raspberry vinegar and some treats. And Bell was just so ecstatic that he actually achieved this. Now at this point, he's in his older years. This is about 65 years old at the time or so, 63. So he never stopped inventing and creating. One thing that he never did when he was working on kites or planes or anything else was actually get on the plane or get on the kite to fly it. He let the young men do that. His work with flight started with the Aerial Experiment Association. That was a group he formed because of his wife's advice. He didn't have the technical knowledge to create these things, so he hired young people who did. So we had Douglas McCurdy, who was a young man from Baddeck. The Bells knew him. He was practically a son to them. He went to university in Toronto to be an engineer. While he was there, he befriended Casey Baldwin, who was also studying engineering, and he asked Casey to come with him to Baddeck for the summer to work with Bell. And Bell said, sure, bring him over. And Casey, of course, went, yeah, I'm going to work with him. He wound up staying for 42 years. Spent his whole life there, basically, working with Bell. Even after his passing, he still worked there. The third person was Glenn Curtis from Hemmelsport, New York. He was involved in motorcycle motors and building motorcycles. And then there was Thomas Selfridge. He was sent by the U.S. Army to observe the experiments because Bell's group was farther advanced in technology than the Wright brothers were, and they wanted to know how far advanced he was and work on that and work with him for their own use. At this point, Bell is an American citizen, so anything he's doing, the U.S. wants to know what he's up to. So when they had the successful flight and they completed that project, Selfridge was sent back to the States to work with the Wright brothers, and sadly, he's the first person killed in a plane crash as a passenger when Orville Wright crashed his plane. That was a very sad day for the Bell family. Mrs. Bell was quite heartbroken by that news. And after that, they just disbanded the AEA because there was no further use to having it. They achieved their flight. So after this project was over, Bell kept on working on many different things. His last big project, you'll see down here in the hall, the hydrofoil boat, what he called the hydrodrome. The one on the far end wall is the original one that he built, quite disassembled right now because it was left to rot on the beach basically. So what could be salvaged of it was brought here to the museum. And this one here you see is the one Parks Canada built in the 1970s to show you what the original looked like. So they used Bell's specs and designs to reproduce it. This apparently can actually go across the water, but it was built inside the museum, so we can't take it out for a spin. It would be quite fun to do that. The motors are original. There are no mufflers on them. So the ones that were actually driving on this thing were quite hard of hearing for quite a while afterwards. Mrs. Bell actually took a skip on the boat when she was 65. She did 2 runs on it, and because she was deaf, the noise didn't bother her. She had a wonderful time, and as you can see by this picture up on the wall, Bell is standing at the wharf waiting for her to come back, kind of concerned about her, and she was just thrilled with the whole thing and was just like a young girl, just laughing and giggling, having a wonderful time. He could not be convinced to actually go on the boat or on the airplanes, because as I mentioned before, he preferred to observe, document, examine, and figure out any problems he had. But the one thing he was doing in all of his creations was safety first. He always tried to incorporate measures, protocols, design issues to make everything as safe as possible for the person actually trying to fly or drive this thing. When you come along here, you'll see all the other things he's doing, towing targets, and he even worked with helicopter rotors. There was nothing that didn't interest him. Among other things he did, I meant again with sound, when he was doing his telephone invention and his photophone and all that, he actually wrote that one day telecommunication would be you could actually communicate through a wire overseas. You could telegraph someone and communicate electronically. If you look at your cell phone now and, texting and emailing and whatnot, he predicted that. He actually said when they started doing his work with flight that the day would come when you could have your supper, have breakfast here in Europe, and then fly back across the Atlantic Ocean to have your next day's meal that very same evening. And they thought he was crazy when he said that, to have one meal on one continent and the other meal on the other continent the next day. That turned out to be true. We have transatlantic flight now. A lot of the things he was saying and doing, he predicted, and this was like careful thought and just thinking ahead and just not having constrictions in how he thought. Basically, he had no box to be in. He was thinking outside the box without actually having a box. Whatever came into his mind, that's what he came up with, and that's what he was doing, and they thought he was crazy, but turns out he wasn't. Throughout his life, his wife Mabel was his partner by his side. He very much relied on her advice, her counsel, her thoughts. She had a different way of looking at things, and she knew how to manage him. She knew how to look after his health. In later years, when he developed diabetes, she very unsuccessfully tried to keep him out of the pantry at night to steal food he shouldn't be eating. That didn't work for her. But she did manage to keep him going and keep him focused on a lot of the things that he was going on, because his mind was going all over the place. And she had to learn to rein him in and let him focus on one thing at a time. She, unfortunately, went a lot of years without being recognized for her contribution. He was always known as Dr. Bell, mostly because of 13 honorary doctorates that he was given for his medical and scientific research and his invention of the telephone and all kinds of other things. She never got to be recognized until 2016, when Cape Breton University actually gave her an honorary doctorate for her contributions to what she did in the community, which was long overdue and much welcomed. We have that certificate in the presentation hall. When we do our presentations on Benveria, we can now talk about her and put her right alongside her husband, where she always belonged, and have her proper recognition. So she's also Dr. Bell, but we refer to her as Dr. Mabel Bell because one of the great-grandchildren, Dr. Mabel Grovner, she was Dr. Bell for so many years that we now have to make a distinction. Dr. Mabel Grovner was a retired pediatrician, and she lived to be 101. She was 17 years old when her grandparents passed away, so she had very clear memory of her grandparents and what was done in the estate and the work being done, who was there. So if you would ask her something about the estate or the history of the place, you could check with her to find out, because she was there, she knew. And if you were silly enough to ask her, are you sure that's true, she would say, I'm the only person left alive that knows this. If nobody else can contradict me, so it must be true. So now we have to say Dr. Mabel and Dr. Mabel Bell to distinguish one from the other, which I'm only happy to do.
And with that, we came out of the tour with a wealth of knowledge. This little museum in the middle of nowhere was a treasure we didn't expect to find. Our optimism grew about the remainder of our time in Cape Breton. If this is what our experience was like with Parks Canada in northern Nova Scotia, what did the rest of our trip look like? You see, we were about to head to Highlands National Park and the world-famous Cabot Trail. Why not join us as we hit the trails and explore this beautiful region of Eastern Canada? Be sure to subscribe as we explore this and other amazing sections of the globe.